Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first Unchained Live, sponsored by QuantStamp. Thank you for joining us. And now, please welcome to the stage, host of Unchained, Laura Shin.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to have you all here at the first Unchained Live. Your no-hype resource for all things crypto is on stage at Pulitzer Hall, Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. For those who don't know, Unchained is my weekly hour-long podcast that covers all things crypto, and in a few months it will be 3 years old. When I started this podcast, I never ever imagined that it would become something big enough where I could hold an event like this. So I really, really appreciate you all for listening to the show and for coming tonight. It's also really meaningful to me to be doing this event here at Columbia Journalism School because I came here for grad school 11 years ago, and at that time, kind of like my podcast, I never imagined I would someday be doing an event in this very building. And hilariously, until tonight, my main memory of this particular floor in the building is that on the night of graduation, my friends and I all had a dance party in the room at the other side of the hall. So now I'm making new memories in this space. Anyway, our guest for today is one of crypto's biggest stars, one of its biggest leaders, who himself started in this space as a journalist. Please give a warm welcome to Vitalik Buterin, the creator of Ethereum. Welcome, Vitalik.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks for coming out to New York for this. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to jump right into questions. Normally in journalism, if you're an editor, they say you should give your comments to writers in what's called a nice sandwich. And you could apply that concept to interviews, but unfortunately I'd have to dispense with the nice parts in the beginning because I really want to get to the meat of the conversation. We have a very limited time. So my first question is kind of like a question that's actually for you and for the audience. And actually what we're going to do to tee up the questions, we're going to play a video. And it's a video, I think you've probably seen it. And some may have seen it, but for those who haven't, it's a video of Fred Wilson at Union Square Ventures in conversation with Tushar Jain of Multicoin Capital at the Multicoin Capital Summit. And I think Fred's view here is representative of a lot of people's, that it's not just his opinion, but you can see he has kind of a lot of emotion about where Ethereum is right now. So for the audience, my question for you is you'll watch the video, and then we're going to go to this website called Slido, which is sli.do. Some of you may have actually pre-submitted questions there earlier, and you'll enter the code Unchained where you can answer this poll. And the question is, do you agree with what Fred Wilson is saying here, which is Ethereum losing its lead? So again, that's Slido, sli.do, and you'll enter the code Unchained to answer the poll. So let's play this video, and just for context, at the beginning he's talking about strong executive leadership.
And we do that a lot for our companies. Ethereum needs that, right? We know that Vitalik is not CEO. Vitalik is an evangelist. He's a brilliant computer scientist. But Ethereum should be more like a company, right? You look at what EOS is doing and you look what Ethereum is doing, and it's like, if Ethereum was doing what EOS was doing, they'd be crushing it, but they're not. And they don't have enough money. They don't have enough developers. They don't, their go-to-market strategy is non-existent. They're not behaving like a company. And if all of us who own Ethereum could go to Vitalik and say, look, this thing you got going in Switzerland, it's not working. Fire these fuckers who don't know what the hell they're doing, and put somebody great in there who could help you build this thing into a monster. That's what we would do. I don't know how to do that. There's no mechanism to do that. That's painful. Just sitting there holding the asset, just watching them whittle the value away, and you're like, God damn it. I know what to do here. Just look at it. Every great company has done this. Just do that. And they don't do it.
And it's hard to get them to listen, right? Because first of all, who do you have to convince? Right? In this case, maybe it's Vitalik, but there's a whole decentralized group of developers, et cetera, that need to be convinced. And like, this is exactly kind of the question that we're trying to think of is,
Well, if that whole group thinks that they're killing it, then they got their head up their ass, okay? They're not killing it. They're blowing it.
they
right?
have the lead.
And they're blowing it.
Yep.
And it's just like, it's so obvious what to do, and they're not doing it.
So, okay. If you are in the audience and on the live stream, go to sli.do and vote for this poll. But we're not going to share the results because what I want Vitalik to give us your response to what he's saying in this video.
Yeah, I mean, I guess first of all, like, if Bitcoin was run like a business, would it have succeeded? And I feel like we kind of intuitively know the answer. And so, it's definitely a structure that works for some things, but like blockchains and cryptocurrency and all of those things that come with that package are just fundamentally kind of so much more and kind of so different from a kind of traditional company or a software product. So I'm really not at all sure that like that kind of model is anywhere close to the right model. So in terms of like what our model is, right? Like we've definitely had these discussions inside of the foundation, and there's definitely been people from time to time that just said, yeah, we need to go in with guns blazing and fire those bastards, and then get the 40 people in and like stick them in the middle of some NIMBY in Silicon Valley and get them to pay $10,000 a month of rent, get them to work for 16 hours every day, rah 6 months, and like we got Ethereum 3.0, man. And like, no. I mean, I would say rather that Bitcoin succeeded in large part because it adopted a model that's very, very different from that. And we've been adopting a model that's very different from that. Though, at the same time, like one of the things that we did is for our 2.0 strategy, right? We have this approach where the foundation is not the thing in the middle that's building everything. The foundation is being a hub for things that need a hub. Like for example, writing out a hub and writing out the spec and specifying it, bringing it to completion. But then the work on making 2.0 implementations is kind of distributed among Prismatic Labs and Lighthouse and Consensus and these other companies. And these other companies internally can be kind of structured in very different ways. And they some of them could be based in one place, some in another place. They might have different kinds of people in them. And really, if even a couple of them succeed, then at least the software implementations of Ethereum 2.0 exist and it's developed. And from a scaling point of view, like as some of our community members in public have said, even if Ethereum 2.0 is never developed, there's Ethereum 1.x, there's ZK Rollup, there's channels, there's Plasma. And
so you were kind of taking issue with his framing of
yeah, like I guess the point I'm trying to make is that there is a kind of focused and deep approach to doing things, and there is a broad approach to doing things, and we definitely are explicitly taking the broad approach to doing things, and I'd argue it's like a very good one for things like Bitcoin and Ethereum.
But so just because we've got this poll going too, I'm just curious, do you feel like Ethereum is losing its lead or no? Is that just? And
it's definitely lost some lead to some extent, and I think that's just because it's kind of inevitable and unavoidable because Ethereum really was the first general purpose smart contract thing to try to do anything. And Bitcoin, for example, was the first cryptocurrency. And originally, as far as cryptocurrencies go, it had 100% market share, then went to 95, and then now it's around 51. And as industries mature and markets grow over time, there's more projects and more projects that try to do different things. And that's people learn over time that there's more different models that you could try, and there's different projects that are trying different models, and that's part of that part's an inevitable part of the process.
Simply because the space is so new?
Yeah, because the space is so new and because the space is just becoming less new over time.
All right, so let's just quickly look at the results. I'm just curious to know. So actually people mostly strongly disagree that Ethereum is losing. Okay, so good. That's good because from some of the behavior I'm seeing on Twitter, I wondered about that. Although, honestly, to be fair, this is probably an audience that's very friendly to you. So one other thing that I wanted to ask, though, about this kind of competition aspect is, like, Ethereum has always been kind of very unicorns and rainbows when it came to other blockchains. Like, you had Zcash and Eternity and perhaps even other blockchain teams at DEF CON 4. But, at the same time, we're seeing this new movement, I guess, really in Ethereum, where recently Ethereum core developer Afri Shodan tweeted, "Polkadot delivers what Serenity ought to be, changed my mind," and he was attacked on social media and actually driven out of Ethereum. I've had other people express anxiety to me about Polkadot, presumably because it could make Ethereum one of like many parachains, instead of Ethereum being a launchpad. There's also worries about substrate. I mean, there's all kinds of things going on. So right now, here we are, you're trying to build this thing that it's not going to be done for a couple of years. Meanwhile, Polkadot and some of these other potentially competitive blockchains are either launching soon or have recently launched. So do you worry that like your roadmap is too long compared to where they are in their development?
And I would say, first of all, that like pretty much every project is like generally optimistic about what they say they're going to do. So, like, for example, even the big Bitcoin sidechains. Remember back in 2014, like 3 months after the initial announcements, when Bitcoin sidechains were the thing that was going to kill Ethereum.
Right.
It was like the first of the it was like the first of the Ethereum killers, and like people were saying, yeah, Ethereum doesn't need to exist anymore. And then now, what do we have? Well, there's like one side chain, which is basically like a permission consortium chain between exchanges.
Yes.
So it's things definitely like all of these things are harder than they seem, and even after launch, like things are harder than they seem. And like a lot of the problems that we see that are also problems that all these other projects are going to see.
So you're not worried about like Polkadot or so like
and I'm definitely not worried about them kind of replacing Ethereum or any of those kind of more extreme versions. Like basically because like I do think that like building Ethereum isn't just like a technical thing. There's also an ecosystem to build out. There's tools other than a blockchain. There's a community to build. There's all these things that like do really take a significant amount of time.
But why do you think this like strain of Ethereum maximalism is emerging? Like literally on my way over here, I saw that Taylor Monahan had a tweet about it earlier today too. Like why is it happening, and what do you think of it?
Yeah, it definitely is. Like in general, I think. I forget where I made this comment, but it might have been in some conversation with Tyler Cohen or somewhere else. I made this comment that people are at their most evil not out of greed but out of fear. And that was, it is probably true that there's a new wave of like people making noises about how they'll like basically kill Ethereum, and there's like that does lead to like people who, being afraid and people kind of taking that not too well. And I mean, that definitely isn't something that, like, I definitely really want to wish and hope that the Ethereum community can kind of find a way to interact with these other crypto projects that are emerging. That's not kind of crypto or not Ethereum maximalist, or not maximalist in general, in the kind of horrible ways and connotations that word has. Though, I mean, at the same time, there's also this kind of other opposite current where people are, I think there's some people that are worried that because we have this kind of anti-maximalist culture that basically is the reason why, like, in the Ethereum space, like, people just immediately call, like, basically call other community members out for being maximalist. which isn't something that happens at all in many other crypto communities. And like basically there's this kind of counter current where there's other people who basically believe that the anti-maximalists are kind of being played for chumps, like they're playing cooperate when other people are playing defect in the prisoner's dilemma. And like that might be true sometimes, might not be true sometimes, but it's something that we need to kind of probably carefully consider and evaluate on a case-by-case basis.
But so what is your take on competition? Like, would you be upset if there was another, competing blockchain that took the lead? Like, how would you personally feel about that? I'm curious.
It depends which blockchain. Like, I think, like, I mean, like I'm not afraid to like shit on projects I think are terrible, right? So if Tron overtakes Ethereum, then first of all, I'll continue to believe it to build on Ethereum because I believe that the world and humanity needs to have a decentralized platform. And second, I will have lost a certain amount of hope for humanity, but not all, not nearly all. So if it's some like very reasonable and very competent technical platform, then ultimately I hope to find ways to have kind of positive sum and collaborative relationships with these projects as much as possible. And I feel like the Ethereum community has shown that it's capable of doing that. Like for example, it's had a very positive relationship with Zcash pretty much since the beginning. Relations are even warming with Ethereum Classic recently. And even, I don't know if you've seen the recent Peace Bridge projects. There's even Bitcoin Cash tends to be fairly friendly, especially now that it's basically kind of exercised its big demon within.
Talking about Craig, right?
Yes. You see, I'm not afraid to criticize. So I guess like the ideal outcome for me definitely is, like I've said anti-maximalist things in general, like when the maximalists were just Bitcoin maximalists, and I really do believe in my heart that like I want to see an environment where different approaches to things can thrive and prosper, and kind of Ethereum can win, and other projects that do interesting things can win too. And if we can find that way, I think that really would be best. Okay. But like if that can't happen, and Ethereum ends up just being much less relevant because people switch from it to other technologies, I definitely much rather it be some competent technical chain than one of these scam projects.
All right. So one other thing I wanted to ask about this video was back when this was circulating on Twitter, somebody tagged you in some tweet related to it, and Preston Van Loon of Prismatic Labs, which is creating a sharding client for Ethereum 2.0, tweeted, or he responded to it saying that he and others on his team were struggling to deliver because they still had to work these full-time jobs. And for those of you who missed it, Vitalik wrote back YOLO and sent Prismatic 1,000 ETH. And then that was what enabled them to quit their full-time jobs, or at least Preston, and he runs Prismatic full-time now. But, so I saw this happen, but also we've got these Ethereum core developers that have been telling me, they're working on some of the most essential aspects of Ethereum, but they're underfunded. Sometimes their salaries are at maybe 60% of what they would be if they were working at a startup as a developer. And even with a startup, they'd also get equity. And meanwhile, they watched the Ethereum Foundation give, $4 million to Starkware, which is a competing blockchain. So
Starkware is not a competing blockchain.
Oh, okay.
No, it's a company that's just building ZK Stark technology.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But is that still something that you would give a higher priority to compared to some of the core Ethereum teams? Because for them, they feel like, whoa, how are these funding priorities being set?
I think those are definitely very reasonable questions to ask. I think it's also important to recognize this sort of in the context of the history of the kind of foundation and its kind of funding capacities and some of the inefficiencies in its funding capacities. So like, for example, we had, back during the sale, we had $18 million. And that $18 million quickly turned into 9 because we weren't able to turn it into cash quickly enough. And just because of a kind of quite spendy culture that some people in the foundation had early on, the 9 kind of whittled down to 1 fairly quickly. But then fortunately, the Ethereum launched, the foundation had its Ether, and that made it adopt this kind of very careful and cautious attitude toward funding, like pretty much funding anything. And so our expenditures were pretty low, but then the Ether price just suddenly shot up by a factor of literally more than 1,000. And like our norms definitely kind of didn't adjust kind of as quickly as the realities did. And then there was another correction. And at the start of last year, like we announced this big grant program. And the goal of that was to basically, it's kind of like a triage project to just identify the biggest categories of things that were not getting funded that just needed to start getting funded. So some of the earliest stuff included like L4 state channel stuff. It included like some of the ETH2 client teams. It included some plasma projects. It included some other things. It included these big academic grants. And those things really did need to be funded. And now, more recently, of course, there's this, the price went down by a factor of 10 again. And in part because like we didn't end up kind of getting out of hand and like actually adjusting our spending up by a factor of 1,000. Like we have not had to do any rounds of layoffs. We haven't had to kind of do any of those things.
So some of this is like kind of organizational, like it sounds like I saw you tweeting about how people could be paid via smart contracts in a very flexible way. Maybe that's something you guys should look at.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a kind of internal experimentation happening. Like part of the benefit of this sort of Ethereum core foundation structure that's not a corporation that we've developed over time is that there's a lot of kind of little projects and little experiments happening inside of them. So like I think like AFSA's team, like some of them have been getting paid in DAI, and then there's people getting paid with these with these channel mechanisms. There's then there's grants, there's salaries, there's like all of these different scales of things. There's trials, like what we call hack turnships, and a bunch of other things.
But just to go back, like in general, I feel like from what I've learned from some interviews is that there are people working on this who feel like, hey, how are these priorities being set? And so it sounds to me like there's probably room for improvement, at least from their perspective.
There definitely is, though. I think. I don't. Whoever said that, I don't know their specific situation, but it's also important to remember that, like, especially like during the periods where like you're adjusting downwards, like if nobody's complaining, that means you're overpaying basically, and that's yes. Well, okay, so let's keep talking actually about this specific topic, because there's been a new development where, as you probably know, there's this new decentralized autonomous organization called Moloch DAO. For those of you who missed it, my episode that came out on Tuesday was great about this, like super interesting. But essentially, Moloch DAO is a DAO where members will be voted in. And upon acceptance, they receive these shares that give them the ability to vote on different proposals that will help further Ethereum 2.0 development. What's your take on Moloch DAO? It's definitely an interesting experiment. And it's, first of all, like I'm really glad to see like people in the community kind of taking charge and just making these independent pushes to kind of push Ethereum and the Ethereum ecosystem forward in the different ways that they think make sense. Like I think that's valuable both because we have the kind of benefit of these different philosophies getting tried. It also means that if the Ethereum Foundation does have like institutional constraints a lot of the time, like these other organizations or DAOs or whatever don't have them, or they have different constraints, so they can kind of fill in some of our gaps. So I think all of those things are good. The one big kind of challenge that I see is that, like, ultimately these kind of nonprofit DAOs are still like just like basically a way of organizing charity spending, and like they can provide some improvements, but ultimately this kind of public goods problem that basically people are throwing money into things that benefit way more people than just themselves, and so they're like, unless they're really, really altruistic, they're gonna put in kind of far too little money to actually, like, basically far less money than kind of would be optimal if everyone sort of had everyone's interests in mind. Then like basically like the DAO by itself doesn't just magically make these like public goods problems and tragedies of the commons go away. And so there's definitely, and I'm very grateful to all of the people that have contributed to Moloch DAO, but at the same time, Moloch DAO by itself is still, and I don't expect it to balloon into like EOS-sized like pools of money that can go and do like the kinds of things that people that want us to have EOS-sized spending want us to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, because like the actual DAO was something where people were expecting a return, but this is like, again, it's going to have that free rider problem where other people in the community will be like, okay, they want to put their money in to fund Eth 2.0 development, fine. But one other thing I wanted to ask about was there's this other idea floating around, which is inflation funding for development. And Zcash does it, where 20% of the block reward goes to fund such a development. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, and I did read the EIP. I think it was at 1867 or like some like number in that range that was released today. It's interesting that people are starting to discuss it. I mean, I think probably two of the big challenges to that. I mean, one of them is kind of just political, which is the community, I think, hasn't fully decided like how it feels about the kind of governance making like subjective economic decisions on that level of subjectiveness. And like, so for example, the Bitcoin community would definitely be hard against this sort of thing. Like they'd even be hard against redirecting parts of the existing block reward, even if it keeps the cap, to things like this, because they would say, oh, it's centralization, it's taxes, and like these things are evil and all that. Now, on the other hand, you have projects that like take the opposite extreme and basically use on-chain governance to like push out inflation rewards to projects. And I've written articles about like how this can easily, like this is just fundamentally not incentive compatible. It can lead to plutocracy, it can lead to cartels. And I think it might even be possible to make a kind of almost a mathematical theorem that basically says something like, in an anonymous system, it's impossible to create a system that funds public goods without creating a system that rewards cartels. And the reason is that there's just no way for an anonymous system to distinguish between $10 million of coins split between 10,000 people that are struggling to overcome free rider problems versus $10 million that are split between 10,000 accounts that are all owned by the same cartel. That's just one guy trying to funnel more money to themselves. And that's, we in the case of EOS, for example, we saw these scandals about, you got these delegates and then they're voting for each other, and then they're voting in exchange for payments, and all of these things that kind of technically break voting systems if you analyze the economics. And like I do worry about that kind of capture if we make a system that's kind of formalized in the wrong way. Now in the middle,
basically it's like gamifiable.
Yeah, I mean, in the middle there's like Zcash, but then Zcash is interesting. It's definitely like big props to them for just doing that and being proud of that and saying like, yeah, we got a 20% dev tax. What's up, man? And that I am very proud of them for doing that. So great job, Zuko. But on the other hand, like they clearly haven't solved the problem of like where to allocate the money, because right now they just basically just have this centralized allocation pool that goes to the Zcash company, it goes to these individuals and these other individuals, and they have hard forks, and in these hard forks they can decide to reallocate the pool, but then what process do they use to decide? And so it's definitely very far from kind of the ideals that a lot of people see cryptocurrencies having. And I mean, like that's not definitely very far from saying Zcash is bad or anything. Like, it's still it's still an improvement over no funding, but centralized funding is still. Like, it would be really nice if there was some decentralized process for achieving the same thing. Now, in terms of decentralized processes, I'm a big fan of Glenn Wiles' CLR, quadratic finance mechanism.
Yeah.
And
can you describe that for people? He was on
yeah.
my show too, by the way. That was a great episode. You guys should listen to that.
Yeah. So basically, the idea here is that it's a kind of spin on one of Glenn's earlier ideas, which is quadratic voting, which is a method for voting which takes into account the strengths of people's preferences, and like under certain conditions, you can prove that basically if A wins a quadratic vote over B, then A is on balance, basically A makes people altogether happier than B would. And the way that liberal radical subsidies work is that you have this mechanism where anyone can put in a pool, put in some money toward projects, and then for each project there is a set of people that put money into it. And then the way it works mathematically is that you take each person's contribution, then you take the square root of each person's contribution, then you add all of those square roots up, and you take the square of that sum, and then the square of the sum of the square roots is bigger than just a regular sum, and pretty much always if there's more than one contributor. So you have some central funding source basically cover the difference. The way that it works kind of more philosophically, you might ask, well, why square roots, why squares, why sums, is that you can think of it as a mechanism that through the amount of money that each person contributes, kind of measures basically how much they care about the project, and in a certain mathematical sense. And then the mechanism itself imagines if there existed a kind of virtual agent that cared as much as all of the contributors care put together, then and that virtual agent was the one that had a lot of money to contribute, then how much money would they contribute? And that amount is always going to be more than the amount that people contribute in isolation, because this kind of virtual agent that cares as much as all the contributors put together is sort of one agent and doesn't kind of have free rider problems with itself. So it's really cool math, but the general principle is that it's this way, if you have a pool of money that is kind of designated toward funding kind of public goods as a category, then it allows you to choose which public goods to fund and how much in a way that is kind of credibly neutral, credibly kind of not biased towards specific organizations.
And would you think about using that to experiment with, inflation funding?
Yeah, I mean, so we are, Gitcoin is using it right now, and I think it started in the first round, in my opinion, went really well, and it started the second round recently. The main impediment I see to just pumping Ethereum inflation directly into a CLR is that CLR does depend on some notion of identity. So basically the reason is, once again, how do you distinguish between 10,000 people that are suffering from a free rider problem versus 10,000 sock puppets of the same rich guy?
Right.
And fake accounts are really easy to get. If you have a phone right now, if you go to buyaccs.com, you can just buy piles of Gmail and Reddit accounts. Just go ahead and look and try. It's
Is this something you've tried?
No comment.
Yes.
No, the point like basically, like it's important to kind of not be naive about this, because we're like, there are regardless of what any of us know or try to do, there's entire industries of people who like spend their lives like as a full-time job, like figuring out how to like grab up these accounts and automate them, and then if they rely on cell phones, and they have those cell phone racks and they hook them up and like they simulate clicking buttons, and like, I mean, this is like, there's PR firms that do this. This is like basically
There's crypto teams that do this. Crypto people. There's
Yeah. I mean, what, like, did Hacking Team do any of that? I mean, I have no idea.
I don't know. I don't know. But I mean,
so
yeah.
Like basically the point is that, like, if you don't have an identity system that's robust, then eventually you're going to have like a guy with 10,000 sock puppet accounts taking over this kind of system and using it to drain money. And so this does depend on a robust identity system, and it also depends on collusion resistance, which is the term I use for mechanisms where you don't have the ability to prove how you participated to anyone else. And the reason why that's important is because if you don't have that property, then you can like really easily bribe people to participate in some way with smart contracts. Like you can, like if you imagine for for votes, like it's easy, like the idea of buying votes is probably familiar to people, but this applies to like any kind of mechanism, right? Even like with a CLR, for example, right? Like if I throw in $10, then I get like $10 square root 3.16 whatever, and then square again up to 10. But then if you were to throw in $1, then my $10 gets square root of 3.16, add to yours 4.16, and then the result would be somewhere between 17 and 18. And so then like your $1 adds somewhere between over $7 to the total pie. And so that would mean is that if you could prove how you voted and that was malicious, then I would bribe you $3 to throw $1 into the pot. You would earn $2 and I would still earn more than a $5 profit. So like these attacks exist, and there are like worldwide industries that are dedicated to exploiting them. So we need to be careful.
All right, yeah, so all this, if you ever end up implementing it, sounds like it's going to be way down the line, because I know there's other things on your to-do list that are higher up. So let's move on. One other thing, so we were talking about Malik DAO. One other thing that came out of this interview I did with Amin, who founded Malik DAO, Amin Soleimani, by the way, for those of you who don't know him. He believes that the Ethereum community should put a greater emphasis on the price of Ether because of its role in securing the network, especially under proof of stake. And did you see that Delphi Digital report?
Yes.
Yeah, that was super interesting. If you guys missed it, incredible report. But basically, they talked about how the upgrade to Serenity would rely too much on fees, and that kind of put the security of the network at risk. And they showed how, like, in a number of scenarios, it really wouldn't be very profitable for validators. So do you think the price of Ether is important? And how much do you think about that while you're designing the protocol and working on things like fees, block rewards, staking, inflation, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be like really candid because that's the right thing. I think like a lot of at least some of the earlier kind of rhetoric of like, especially veering on the more extreme side of like the price not mattering at all, came. I mean, in part it was kind of counter signaling to like distinguish ourselves from other crypto projects that just care about that just. Like do like pumping and lamboing way too much. But another thing is that it was about kind of minimizing legal risk by basically basically trying to kind of make the project seem more distant from like something that would be covered by financial regulation. And I think more recently it's I think at this point, it's like people and regulators know what cryptocurrencies are, and they know that it's good. They have a price. There's a cryptocurrency. These prices go up and down, and there's these networks, and these networks, you can build applications on them, and these applications provide a lot of value to people, and they. like even like if people try to claim the price doesn't matter at all, like they're totally going to see through that, right? So it's like I
So
definitely.
how much does it matter to you?
It definitely. I mean, I can tell you why. Like what things are clearly important about like why the price being higher rather than lower, for example, is good, right? So one of them is obviously security. So if the price is zero, the network can't be secure, and that's true in proof of work or proof of stake. Another reason is obviously that there's a lot of projects who in the ecosystem that hold cryptocurrency, and they either and if the price is higher, then they'll have more money to do the things that they want to do, right? And like these are things that are just obvious, and you can it's just obvious from looking on the internet that like crypto projects hold a lot of their money in cryptocurrency, and they'll be better funded if prices go up.
All right,
but like
so
from a network point of view, also I know security is just an important kind of thing. Like basically, if prices drop to zero, then there's no way that security can happen. So I think like in terms of kind of descriptively explaining like why people do care, and it's obviously a combination of those things, and then there's people that hold cryptocurrency and they want prices to go up.
Yeah, sometimes I think that's what the maximalists are.
Yeah, and definitely. But I think like those are, I mean, like especially the kind of security concern is definitely just a totally legitimate technical argument. And there are members of the Ethereum community that just say that, you know, Ether is a cryptocurrency and we want it to be more of a cryptocurrency. And that's something that, like, the Ethereum Foundation, you know, like as I think it's become clear, kind of doesn't have a monopoly on Ethereum messaging or even a hegemony on Ethereum messaging at this point, and that's a kind of direction that, you know, people like Moloch DAO and other groups are going to promote. Then there's not much that we can do to stop them even. And
So actually, I want to do another poll. So if you guys want to take out your phones, and also for you on the live stream, go to sli.do. And I just want to ask you this question. Do you think Ethereum developers are focusing enough on the Ether price? And we'll just look at the results right away, because I'm just kind of curious to know what the community feels about that. Oh, okay. So we've got a lot of don't cares. That's interesting. Oh, but so there's a little bit more yes. Oh, there's some people who just are like, I don't know. But don't cares. Still
That's
winning.
interesting, yeah. I mean, don't care, no.
Okay, well, there you have it. So there's all these critiques out
so
there.
Interesting.
And
Yeah, I mean,
it is really interesting,
like,
actually.
I think it's, I mean, like engineering for economic. I think also like if it depends on like how you kind of ask the question, because there's a difference between like the thing that I am absolutely opposed to is like for just engineering for pumps for the sake of pumps, right? Because that's just a short-term strategy that's fundamentally dishonest. The thing that I'm definitely in favor of is like not doing stupid things that would lead to the price going to zero. So one example of that would be just like having an issuance of like 100 million Ether every year, right? That would like, regardless of what other consequences that has, that would clearly, you know, drop the price to zero, and that would clearly just be terrible.
Right, so I want to actually ask you about something somewhat similar, because obviously we've gone through this recent bubble, this ICO mania. I've heard you express relief that that's over. But I'm just curious to know, like, how do you feel about the fact that a large part of Ethereum's success came from the fact that it was used as this launchpad for the ICO craze?
And that's definitely true to some extent. I mean, to some extent, though, like ICOs are something that just is going to happen on some platform, regardless of like what platform it ultimately was. And you know, before Ethereum, there was Mastercoin and other things happening on Bitcoin. Then, before Ethereum launched, there was MadeSafe, and there were all these other projects that were launching, and they were using like kind of Bitcoin-based like second layers. So I feel like that boom would have happened regardless of what platform it ultimately would have happened on. And that it's definitely a kind of complex situation that's had a lot of costs and benefits to it. I mean, one of the big benefits is just a lot of interesting projects getting funded. And there's a lot of big Ethereum projects that had token sales. There's a lot of projects that did not have token sales, but that had tokens that launched in other ways, so Maker being one example. And the fact that they have money for development is, I think, like just a good and useful thing.
And but then what about the fact that there were that whole other
space? Yeah, I mean that's definitely one of the biggest costs, that there were these projects that were just scammy. There were projects that were like marketing just way over the top and excessively. There were projects that would run up beside me, like just take a selfie, run away, and then claim that I took a selfie. Like founder of Engine Q Coin took a selfie with Vitalik Buterin. Please buy our ICO.
Right, or you were an advisor. I even was listed as an advisor.
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that I'm like apparently an advisor for. I mean, there's also even my 10,000 Instagram accounts. They're all scams. And those are definitely like very unfortunate things. And if there was a magic wand that could have like shut them all down, that probably would have been better. But magic wands don't exist.
Speaking of things that shut things down, so I wanted to ask you, over the past year, the SEC has said in various ways that Ether in its current form is not a security.
Yeah.
However, from the way they phrased their remarks, it seems that they likely would consider the Ethereum crowd sale as violating securities laws. Are you worried about an enforcement action against you or the other founders?
It's something, so far we haven't seen anything suggesting anything like that happening. So, I mean, we definitely have like our lawyers and legal teams, and they're definitely like watching the situation closely. But so far, we haven't seen any reason to be worried for ourselves.
And is that something you stress about at all?
I would say no. I mean, I'm probably mainly listening to our lawyers and legal teams at this point.
All right. So I wanted to just go back to what you were saying about Glenn Weil. Here you have created this $15 billion ecosystem, but from somebody who is trying to cover what you're doing, I definitely know you have your hands in a lot more things than actually just Ethereum. And when I recently interviewed Glenn, he actually said that you're his closest collaborator. So what are you doing with him, and how does it relate to your work with Ethereum?
Yeah, in terms of what I've done with him, I sent him a review of Radical Markets. I wrote a review of Radical Markets that's still like, sitting there, the big long 5,000-word thing on Vitalik.ca. I worked with him on the liberal radicalism paper. I reviewed some of his recent posts on why I'm not a capitalist, why I'm not a statist, and like all of those other things. In terms of kind of concrete items, those are probably the biggest, but I guess more generally, and like I'll actually be touching on this topic a lot in 2 days because I'm going to Radical Exchange right after this, but it's I view the kind of cypherpunk tradition and the Radical Exchange tradition that Glenn Weil has created so quickly as being kind of two definitely different movements, but that are still kind of ultimately going after fairly similar goals. And the way that I would describe those goals are as being this attempt to kind of synthesize kind of valuing, like things like freedom and openness and kind of systems where like if everyone is on an equal footing and there's no special privilege, with an understanding of the value of community. And in the and as far as kind of understanding the value of community goes, like that's definitely not a kind of universal in the cryptocurrency space by any means, right? But there's definitely things that kind of Ethereum space has kind of cultivated that are almost a reaction to things that other people in other cryptocurrency communities have said. There's people that literally go around and saying things like, oh, there is no like insert coin name here community. There's just a bunch of people that happen to use the same coin, and that's what matters. And like I consider those kind of ideas totally crazy. And that's something that, so like I feel like, there's the kind of cypherpunk tradition, especially kind of 10 to 20 years ago, started out as something kind of very individualistic, but then as it started moving into money and moving into cryptocurrency and moving into these other blockchain applications, it's started to realize that, like, for example, even on a technical level, like money is a much more kind of inherently social thing than, for example, like end-to-end encrypted messaging. And so, and because of that, you just, it's unavoidably have to deal with proof of work, proof of stake, soft forks, UASFs, hard forks, governance, Reddit censorship interfering with governance, and like this entire mess of messy human issues. And like coming up with ways of kind of dealing with that, mitigating and minimizing the worst of it, like trying to benefit from the best of it, is a kind of journey that at least the part of the kind of cypherpunk community that's kind of made its way in both Ethereum and other communities as well, like including Zcash and including all of these other projects, probably even though I disagree with their approach, including like the projects doing on-chain governance and so forth as well. And then on the radical exchange side, you have people that are like basically, see things like Brexit and Trump and all of that, and that are basically kind of dissatisfied with like pretty much every kind of major political trend because they all kind of miss different parts of the picture and are trying to kind of come up with a new approach that like satisfies the kind of ideals of what a lot of people wanted like out of capitalism, for example, and even out of socialism, but does both in a way that, at least as they perceive, avoids the pitfalls of both of the earlier approaches. And so there's definitely a lot of kind of common strands in terms of people's goals, but there's kind of differences in terms of people's approaches. There's differences in opinions. So like, for example, like Glenn, he has this line where he dislikes blockchains because they formalize property without formalizing individuality. And that's whereas in our space, you have Andreas Antonopoulos writing this article a couple of years ago where he literally says like against identity and reputation systems. So like, that's one example of like one of the biggest probably wedges between those two. But there's if they're not literally the same community, there's always going to be wedges, and it's interesting to try to kind of navigate these two different approaches and see what they can learn from each other.
So one other thing that I wanted, because I mean, this is like, when I look at what you're doing with Glenn, it sort of feels like you're kind of branching out just from Ethereum to, trying to do things in the wider world. And when I look at sort of where things are going in the wider world and how that intersects with cryptocurrency, I feel like I'm reading a lot these days about this fear about the future of work, automation, robots, AI. And there's now these proposals around things like universal basic income. And, here we work in this space where we have like digital money and ways to dispense of it. Or to disperse it. So how do you think blockchains will affect the future of work for good and for bad?
Yeah, and I think, first of all, if we want coming up with better solutions to this whole like identity, reputation, and kind of more generally formalizing community is definitely something that we need to have more work on if we want to have more high impact blockchain applications in these areas, because without that, you can't distinguish 10,000 regular people from one rich guy with $10 million, and that's just going to limit you in so many different ways. So, but if you can solve that problem, then potentially you could make a lot of progress. So, and I think in the shorter term, the main value of these systems isn't so much in kind of formalizing like specific new mechanisms that like entire large portions of society will be like building on instead of corporations or governments or whatever. I think like in the near term, the thing that's more viable is basically blockchains as a way of making it just easier for more people around the world to kind of connect into the global economy, and also easier for different kind of existing projects to kind of interface and interconnect with each other more. So one of the kind of pitches that I talk about is the idea that, and like, you can see that people are starting to explore this very concretely in the gaming industry. This idea that you have like a bunch of small companies that, and then there's a big incumbent, and then there's some small companies, and the small companies by themselves have a hard time. But then if they can create some kind of common market or interoperability between them, so in the case of gaming, moving out or trading assets between games, in the case of something like financial systems, there will be these different different wallets or different providers or whatever being able to talk to each other, and by doing that, they can like basically share network effect and kind of stand up against larger monopolists without, themselves kind of coalescing into a monopolist. And I think that's a path that's also in a very socially valuable. But then in the longer term, like as more things happen on blockchains, and as maybe we have more data sources, we have more kind of formalization of things like reputation and identity and community, then some of these kind of grander and more idealistic visions can also kind of start to see the light, and we can really use blockchains as a platform for just experimenting in like very, very different ways of people organizing with each other. So I think like those are definitely all kind of good consequences. In terms of consequences that I'm worried about, I mean, near term, just the whole the dark side of the ICO mania, basically, and kind of in a more generalized sense, also like scams, hacks, thefts, like all of that side is definitely an issue that I think we could be doing more to try to kind of fight, mitigate and fight off.
I was listening to this other podcast. I think it was Software Engineering Daily. Hasib Qureshi did an essay where he just read it, and it was amazing. But it was funny because he was saying that he feels like in the crypto space we're sort of learning all the lessons that the traditional financial system already learned, and that's why they have all those regulations in place. And so it's just funny. But actually, that is another question I wanted to ask you about, and I think this will be our last question actually before we do some Q&A. We've seen this fascinating DeFi trend that's been taking off in Ethereum. I'm a little bit obsessed with it. Like for those of you who didn't notice, I did 0x and Dharma and DYDX and Compound and MakerDAO. I'm super interested in all this stuff. But some of the ideas that are being put into place have the echoes of the financial moves that led us into the 2008 financial crisis. So what's your take on that?
I don't know if you saw like maybe 1 to 2 weeks ago on Twitter, but there was this one project that was promising like 5x leverage with crypto-based derivatives, and I like went on there and criticized them. And like eventually, I thought they had like some pretty reasonable answers to my critiques, but I think even still, like it's importance to do things like that and kind of set the expectation that like we're not here to build things that break. And I think having the DAO happen like so early in the history definitely had some positive effects, because it's definitely kind of did create like a necessary sense of kind of fear and caution. Though now it's been almost 3 years, and like that's definitely not something that's going to last forever. So, and I'm definitely watching the kind of the whole DeFi space with interest and fascination, and I've been like very supportive of Uniswap, for example, all the way through. Hi, Dan, stand up. Hey.
Unconfirmed last week. That was a great episode.
Yeah, I've been, like things like Maker. It's just a project that's useful and that's so refreshing and great. Things and Augur and so forth. But on the other hand, something will break eventually. Actually, I mean, there's two kinds of breaking, right? So like one kind of breaking is the kind of breaking, the financial systems breaking that people are more familiar with, which is, you have these derivatives, and then, because people underestimate the fat tail, suddenly things all go in one direction at the same time. Then some things break, and then and go bankrupt. Then other things that depended on those things not breaking also break, and you have these cascades, and suddenly like a whole bunch of systems just fly wildly out of people's expectations. The other kind of things breaking that I'm also worried about is smart contract code risk. So like, for example, this was another case of actually myself criticizing our own community on Twitter, which by the way, like I do think Ethereans should criticize other Ethereans, both on Twitter and other platforms. Like, it's definitely healthy to, have the kind of antidotes to the extremes of booster culture and all that. But basically, where someone was trying to say something like, why doesn't pretty much everyone like take their money out of their bank accounts and put it into like a DAI earning interest on Compound, because that pays better rates? Like, why would you not just get a free 3%? And I'm like, excuse me, free? Like, you really believe that contract has, are you really that confident that that contract has less than a 3% chance a year of having a bug in it? And I mean, I honestly don't know how to measure the chances those contracts have bugs in them, but there's definitely, like, I think more people, like, far too many people that round those risks down to zero.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about that because, more than 2% of all Ether is locked up in MakerDAO in these collateralized debt positions, and I just worry, or I just wonder, do you worry that that could pose a systemic risk to Ethereum, like if there's a bug, or also there's this regulatory risk because the SEC has been making noise that perhaps stablecoins like MakerDAO could run afoul of regulation?
Yeah, and from a kind of contract security point of view, there's definitely kind of reasons to be more optimistic this time around, like basically because MakerDAO does seem to be like doing things much more slowly and methodically than, say, like the DAO did. And it's taken them a really long time to build everything out and launch, and like like some people have quibbles with their like variable naming styles, but otherwise, like, it's still like on balance it seems. It does seem like they're doing things well, but at the same time, the risk is non-zero, and it could happen, and ultimately, if you're doing a system that's interesting, the risk of things breaking is always going to be non-zero. On the legal side, and ultimately a big part of that just is a question a question for the MakerDAO team. But going beyond that, like if a very large class of things that people want to do on Ethereum get ruled to be basically legally impossible, then that's definitely going to be a very significant loss to Ethereum. Though, ultimately, I think it's also important to note that Ethereum's value is definitely not limited to one sector. Like, even if this financial stuff doesn't happen, there's still ENS, there's still and I made that tweet storm a few months ago on non-financial applications of the Ethereum blockchain, where I talked about things like certificates and key revocation and identity and all of these other things. And I think all of those things are valuable too. The system is definitely going to be kind of keep on evolving and keep on being used by someone, no matter what happens, but there's definitely things that we can do to minimize the risk that people get hurt in the meantime, and I definitely strongly support everyone in the community taking it on as a common responsibility to do some of those things.
Yeah, well, I think that's a perfect place to end. It's sort of like just sort of where we are in the system right now. So we're going to actually queue up our first video question that was pre-submitted by listeners. And this is a super fun one. This comes from Ben from LA. If those of you who listened to my 100th episode where listeners contributed, this guy wrote and recited a whole poem, and it was like a few minutes, and it was all about crypto and my podcast. I mean, it was amazing. So if you have not listened to the episode yet, his poem was a true masterpiece. I highly recommend you check it out. And he submitted a super fun video for today's recording.
If you there, Vitalik B, had a Lambo time machine to join the early cypherpunk scene, what advice would you give Satoshi?
Wait, what? Wait. Okay, no. I was just trying to tell, like, is this thing mixing Back to the Future and Star Wars metaphors? But like, oh. Okay,
So
yeah.
what advice would you give Satoshi?
GitHub.com/Ethereum/ETH 2.0-specs.
Wait, are you serious? Like, you would say this is the advice I'd give Satoshi, like build Ethereum 2.0?
I mean, I do think it's a good architecture, and that's like, you might as well build a good architecture as being the first thing. I mean, otherwise, if we want kind of smaller and more concrete one-sentence things, then I think. And it definitely, first of all, like, Satoshi had a really hard job because he just could not have predicted, like, which way the ecosystem would have went, which way the just the fact that it would turn into anything more than a science experiment and all these other things. So I think, like, on a technical level, at least kind of suggesting a path that opens the door to upgradability to, like, proof of stake and to kind of more powerful virtual machines and all these other things.
By that, do you mean some sort of like governance mechanism, or
not a governance mechanism, just a kind of a technical design that makes it easier to upgrade. So, from a kind of social point of view, definitely to kind of pay attention more to the governance layer as something that could end up failing and getting captured. Satoshi, like, basically just disappeared and kind of handed it off to Gavin, and then things went from there, and then they kind of spiraled out of control a few years later.
Yeah.
And I think actually, here's a good one. Set explicit norms in writing. So, like, for example, and set kind of an explicit, like, direction in writing. So, like, for example, one of the things that we did for Ethereum early on is we said, we are going to do proof of stake and sharding. And we've said that even all the way since 2014 and 2015. And that helped because it, like, basically creates this community agreement that, yes, Ethereum at this time is a chain that technically evolves, and, yes, this is roughly, like, the spirit, like, proposals that change it in the spirit of those ideas that are saying should be adopted. And I think that kind of social contract of technical improvement and, like, even possible of technical improvement in particular directions is something that has ended up serving us very well, and it would have also, it's probably also possibly prevented situations that could have otherwise led to arguments that could have led to stagnation. Like, it could have been the case, like, if those things had not been said, like, there could have been a much larger contingent basically saying, hey, screw proof of stake and screw sharding, let's just keep the chain exactly as it is, or let's go in some totally different direction.
Right.
Yeah, so I think, like, trying to set a more explicit kind of path for future improvement is definitely something that that could have probably very significantly improved the outcome. Okay. Like, I can tell why he didn't, right? Like, when he launched the thing, even in the white paper or somewhere it said, something like, when the system is launched, like, the rules are set in stone forever, which ended up totally not being true. But, this is what you would say if you were someone who just thinks that it is going to be a science experiment and not a multi-million-dollar cryptocurrency.
Yes. Okay, so we'll do the second listener video. And actually, after this, Stephanie, can you give me my phone?
Hi, I'm Chandan Lodha from San Francisco, part of the Coin Tracker team. Thanks, Vitalik, for taking these questions and Laura for organizing. The question is two parts. One, what do you think is going to be the first mainstream use case for cryptocurrency? And second, what do you think about Facebook's initiative to create a stablecoin and messaging apps like WhatsApp? Thanks.
Ooh. So as for the first one, I would say, like, things I am kind of near-term optimistic about include, first of all, in the decentralized finance space. Second of all, the gaming, and like I do mean gaming as in like like video games, not as in like a euphemism for casinos or whatnot. Third, on the non-financial side, like identity, credentials, key revocation, and all of those things. Just even like the HTC phone, like with social key recovery and all that, for example, like has made me more optimistic that things like that could be done. Like basically, it seems like there are kind of platforms that are launching that could just like deploy these identity solutions. For possibly an interesting one I got mentioned from the community and is Parametric Insurance. So this is basically insurance that says if some extreme weather event happens, then pay me $500. And this seems like the reason why it's interesting is because, first of all, it's very useful, and it's particularly the sort of thing that would be useful in like developing environments and economies and like generally kind of under financially included communities and all these other kind of groups of people that we have ultimately wants to help, but also because it's like clearly actually implementable, because it just all that it requires is a data source. And now we have Oracleize, we have Augur oracles, we have all of these other projects that are trying to make oracles at kind of different levels of centralization and decentralization spectrum. So the tools are totally there to build it. So, and there is this project called HurricaneGuard.io that's been like actually building out the thing, and the team, like I think one of them is based in Puerto Rico, the other two are the others are based somewhere else. So I do hope to see more things like that happening, and then from there, I guess we'll see.
And Facebook Coin?
Yeah, Facebook Coin. I honestly don't know enough about it to be able to comment.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll do the third. We'll do the third video then.
Hi Laura, my name is Frank Hutley. I'm from the UK, where I run a blockchain consulting service called FH Blockchain Consulting. I've been a big fan of Unchained for some time. My question for Vitalik is, what would be taught at Vitalik Buterin University?
So the sound on this video is a bit low, but he asked what would be taught at Vitalik Buterin University, which is a cool question, because you didn't even go to college.
Yeah, no. I mean, I guess there's different ways to interpret the question, because there's things that people should learn in general, but then there's things that more people should learn, but if literally everyone in the world focused on them, that would be a disaster. But my goal is, but it really, not necessarily everyone needs to learn all of them. One way to answer it is to just say, the things like cryptography and economics and all of the things that of the technical things of this particular space, but I think that's almost not a very interesting answer, because you can teach different things, but it matters, in my experience, it matters more how things are taught. And I feel like there's ways, society is definitely society's tools of education are like very far from perfect, and there's ways to improve them that at least I feel like I've been trying to kind of do for the spaces that I happen to kind of be more of an expert in, but they could totally be expanded to other spaces as well. So for example, even when I was a Bitcoin magazine writer, I quickly seized upon this kind of seeming gap that we have, where on the one hand we have like popular science articles that are just terrible to the point of being incorrect. On the other hand, we have
I used to be a science writer, just FYI.
Not all popular science articles. On the other hand, you have all offends a different group of people, which is basically math papers, and like computer anything written in LaTeX, even Wikipedia, like that category of things, which just tends to seemingly just place zero or negative value on comprehensibility. And then, you have that and you have that, and there's this wide gap in between of things that are basically materials that actually just actually tell you what's going on and actually like semi-rigorously explain things and like show, here's the actual math, here's how the thing works, and now you can understand how the thing works to the point where you can build it, but do so in a way that also is actually understandable and is relatable to people who have not taken the exact same series of university courses as the author.
Wait, so I'm going to have to stop your answer because we've got a bunch of questions that you all submitted on Slido, and we're running out of time, so I'm just going to ask maybe one or two.
Sure.
The top voted question is a fun one, though, which is, who was your favorite troll in the Ethereum ecosystem?
Ooh. Can I say Kevin Pham?
Maybe I'd have to go with the same. I actually wrote an article about him before I was even into crypto, so that's just kind of we have a history, I guess you could say. All right, next one. What is the most promising ETH competitor in your eyes?
Ooh.
I know, you guys should all be journalists.
Yeah, no, I mean, in terms of like things trying to do like general computation, I mean, I tend to find Dfinity pretty technically competent. For
those of you who didn't hear, he was also on my show. I don't know if he would use the word competent to describe that interview, but anyway.
Dominic's got like really great stuff on things like threshold signatures and distributed key generation, and like he does really Dfinity does really contribute to kind of the leading edge of the space, and that's something that I really respect.
When I was learning about like the beacon chain and all that, I was like, oh, this sounds like Dfinity.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of cross-pollination.
Dominic and I, we don't want to use the word competitor. We use the possibly euphemism, but possibly kind of aspirational term sister network.
Okay. All right. So we are basically out of time. This is sort of a weird place to end where we're talking about Dfinity, but it has been so fabulous having you. So thank you so much for coming. To learn more about Vitalik and Ethereum, check out the show notes inside your podcast player. This first Unchained Live was a massive undertaking. I want to thank Vitalik again for agreeing to be grilled by me on stage and also flying out here.
Yeah.
I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Columbia Journalism School for hosting us. I'd like to thank our venue sponsor, QuantStamp, for helping to make it happen. I also want to give a huge shout out to my event coordinator, Cynthia Helen. Cynthia, back there, thank you so much. She went above and beyond in every way imaginable to make sure this event was a hit. We had a short turnaround time, and she really threw herself into the work and endured a lot of unexpected and last-minute surprises. And she really took care of everything so I could focus on this interview. Big thanks also to Raylene Golapalli, Stephanie Blyer, Stephanie Cohen, Liv Bear, Brittany Newman, AD Catering, Kaylin Buckley, and Tracy Ballin. And let me just point out, this was an all-woman team. Totally unplanned. If you have friends who missed out on the first Unchained Live, let them know they can check out the video of the live stream, which will be at facebook.com/unchainedpodcast. If I can, I will try to also download this for the Unchained Podcast website because I have been getting tweets saying, I already deleted my Facebook account, which I should have thought of before. I'm new with this. If you are not yet signed up for my email newsletter, go to unchainedpodcast.com right now to get my thoughts on the top crypto stories of the week, plus previews of exclusive podcast content. And for the true early birds, my book is coming out in 2 years, so keep your eye out in 2021. Unchained is produced by me, Laura Shin, with help from Ray Lingle and Polly, Fractal Recording, Jenny Josephson, Danielis, and Rich Straffolino. For those of you in the live audience, please stick around. We're going to continue the cocktail hour. And for everybody on the live stream and also here on the audience and also on my podcast, because we'll be releasing that there, thank you for watching and listening.